Hey everyone, this is Dr. Sakshi Arora Hans, your OBGY faculty at Marrow, and today I'm going to take a recall of your OBGY questions which were asked in INI CET November 2021. Now, in November 2021, there were around 22 questions which were asked in OBGY, and all questions were from very high-yielding areas. All those areas where we always tell you that you are going to get a question, questions as expected were from those areas. Most of the questions were very easy and direct questions, and except for just maybe one single question, which was about the IAD PSG criteria, you would have answered all the other questions based on your knowledge from the videos which you have done in Marrow. Now, why this recall? See, till now you know all the answers to all the correct questions. I am not here to give you answers to the questions. I am here so that next time when INI CET happens in May and you are, going through the recall videos, you not only come to know about the correct answer, you also come to know about all those questions which can be formed from that particular topic. As I always say, that once a question is asked, then not only that question becomes important, that particular topic becomes very important. So yes, I am going to take a little more time than usual because I am going to tell you all the important questions which could be formed from that particular topic. Right? So let's get going. According to IAD PSG, the cutoff of fasting blood glucose for GDM is. Now, IAD PSG is International Association of Diabetes Pregnancy Study Group, and IAD PSG has a criteria for diagnosing gestational diabetes. One very important thing which you have to remember is that the criteria which IAD PSG has given, that has been adopted by ADA as well, American Diabetes Association as well. Now, if you remember that American Diabetes Association already has a criteria for diagnosing overt diabetes, and now ADA and IAD PSG, they have their criteria for diagnosing gestational diabetes, which is very different from the criteria we follow in India, the DIPSI criteria. So let's talk about diagnosis of overt diabetes. Now, according to American Diabetes Association, if there is any female in whom fasting blood sugar levels are more than 126, random blood sugar are more than equal to 200, 2-RPP value is more than equal to 200, or HbA1c is more than equal to 6.5. And this should be present in first 20 weeks, right? All of you know that overt diabetes, it is going to manifest to you in first trimester also. So if any of these is present in first trimester, then you say that yes, the patient has overt diabetes. Right? Now, as far as gestational diabetes is concerned, IAD PSG and American Diabetes Association say that you have to do the test once only for these for diagnosing gestational diabetes, and because highest maximum insulin resistance is seen between 24 to 28 weeks, so the time for doing this test is 24 to 28 weeks. And yes, according to this criteria, fasting is needed. According to the DIPSI criteria which we follow in India, fasting is not needed. So the test which they do is, first of all, they call a female fasting between 24 to 28 weeks, and then they are going to take out a fasting blood sugar sample, and then they are going to give 75 grams oral glucose, which has to be mixed in 200 ml of water, and after that they are going to check the blood sugar levels after 1 hour and after 2 hours. So the total values or the total blood samples which have been taken of this pregnant female are 3. Now, IAD PSG says if any one or more than one value comes out to be abnormal, then you diagnose the person as having gestational diabetes. And the values which they have given is, please be very careful. According to this criteria, fasting blood sugar level, it should be more than equal to 92. Right? 1-RPP more than equal to 180 and 2-RPP more than equal to 153. So it's 92, 180 and 153, the criteria which has been given for diagnosing gestational diabetes by IAD PSG as well as by American Diabetes Association. This is very different from the DIPSI criteria which we follow in India. According to the DIPSI criteria, screening has to be done twice. So over here we do screening twice, one in the first antenatal visit and and second time between 24 to 28 weeks. Minimum time gap between the two tests should be 4 weeks. So if a pregnant female is coming to you for the first time at 20 weeks, then in that case, this point becomes relevant that the minimum time gap between two tests should be at least 4 weeks. Now, according to DIPSI criteria, so one difference is this, that we are screening twice, one in the first antenatal visit and then 24 to 28 weeks. We do not have any separate test or criteria for overt diabetes or anything separate for gestational diabetes. We have a single screening test which with the help of which we are going to diagnose gestational diabetes also, and we're going to diagnose overt diabetes also. The second difference is, in DIPSI criteria in India, we do not call the female fasting, right? So fasting is not needed for doing this test. Whenever a pregnant female comes to you for the first antenatal visit, you're going to give her 75 grams of oral glucose, which again you're going to mix it in 200 ml of water, and you're going to tell her to drink it in 10 to 15 minutes. And then after 2 hours, you're going to check her blood sugar levels. If her blood sugar levels are more than equal to 140, you label her as a case of gestational diabetes. If her levels are more than equal to 200, you label her as overt diabetes. Right? Is that clear? This is the criteria which is followed in India, and that is the DIPSI criteria. Now, because they have asked the IADPSG criteria, it could be, especially in central institutes, they are very fond of asking all these criterias. So they may ask you the ACOG criteria. Now, American College of Obstetrician and Gynecologists, they recommend a 2-step test, and they say that screening should be done only in high-risk pregnant females. Whereas in India, according to the DIPSI criteria, screening has to be universal. It has to be done in all pregnant females, because in India, we are at high risk of having diabetes, right? Now, according to ACOG criteria, only in high-risk pregnant females, the first step will be a screening test. So they are going to do 2 steps, one screening test and then a diagnostic test. Now, the screening test is called as a glucose challenge test, which should be done between 24 to 28 weeks. And for screening, no fasting is needed, and you give 50 grams of glucose. After giving 50 grams of glucose, please remember that after 1 hour, you are going to check the blood sugar levels. And if blood sugar levels are more than equal to 140, then the second step is done. Some studies say that if levels are more than equal to 135, then the confirmatory test is done. But if you take the levels as 135, then you get a higher false positive rate, right? That is why the criteria which ACOG now recommends is 140 only. In between, they were saying that let us shift it to 135, but again, it is 140. Right? Now, if the levels are more than equal to 140, then you go for a confirmatory test, which is your glucose challenge, which is your glucose tolerance test. And for glucose tolerance test, fasting is needed. The amount of glucose which you are going to give for a glucose tolerance test, according to ACOG, is 100 grams. Right? So that is why ACOG criteria is very, very different, and you shouldn't confuse between IADPSG criteria, between DIPSI criteria, and between ACOG criteria. As far as your NEET exams are concerned, I would be happy if you remember only IADPSG and DIPSI. ACOG criteria, it should be remembered only for central institutes. Now, so as I was telling you that according to ACOG criteria, first is your screening test, and that screening test is a glucose challenge test where fasting is not needed. 50 grams of oral glucose is given, and then if after 1 hour you are going to check her blood sugar levels, if they come more than 140, then you label the patient that maybe she has diabetes, and you go for a confirmatory test. That is your glucose tolerance test, for which fasting is needed, and you're going to give 100 grams of glucose. And now again another difference, that you are going to check her blood sugar levels at 1 hour, 2 hours and 3 hours after giving that glucose. So the total blood samples which you have taken are 4. Number 1, fasting, then 1 hour, 2 hour and 3 hour. So the GTT which you do in ACOG, it is called as a 100 gram 3 hour GTT. Right? Now, out of these 4 values, if any 2 or more than 2 values are abnormal, then you label her as gestational diabetes. Right? Now, what criteria are they following? They follow the Carpenter-Kooston criteria, according to which 1R PP levels, they should be more if they are, they should be less than 95. If they are more than equal to 95, then you say patient is diabetic. So it is 95, 180, 155 and 140. Right? Now, please remember, according to IADPSG, do not confuse between IADPSG and your ACOG's Carpenter-Kooston criteria. According to IADPSG, fasting sugar levels are abnormal if they are more than 92. According to ACOG's Carpenter-Kooston criteria, they are abnormal if they are more than equal to 95. As far as 1R PP levels are concerned, both are same. And as far as 2R PP is concerned, here it is 155. So do not confuse between the Carpenter-Kooston's criteria, the ACOG criteria, and between the IADPSG criteria. In IADPSG, fasting should be more than equal to 92. In ACOG, fasting should be more than equal to 95. Right? Okay. Just one more thing which I want you to know for the central institutes is the Priscilla-White classification. Although this classification is outdated, still it will be better for the central institute exams if you know it. According to Priscilla-White classification, gestational diabetes, it comes under type A diabetes. And the overt diabetes or the pre-gestational diabetes, they come under non-type A diabetes. In type A, which is gestational diabetes, we have two categories, A1 and A2. A1 means a gestational diabetes which is controlled on diet alone. So a gestational diabetes which is controlled on diet alone is A1, whereas a gestational diabetes which is controlled either on insulin or it is controlled on oral hypoglycemic agents, that comes under type A2. Now, when we talk about overt diabetes, in overt diabetes, which are the non-type A, I want you to remember only 4 categories, although there are more of them, D, F, R and H. So, D stands for overt diabetes with retinopathy. Right? Then F stands with overt diabetes with nephropathy. So, I remember it, F and F. Then overt diabetes with proliferative retinopathy. And then overt diabetes with heart disease. Right? So, we have A1, A2, D, F, R and H. So, this is what I want you to know, questions which are related to the diagnosis of diabetes. Next question was very easy. Dose of dexamethasone given for fetal lung maturity. So all of you know that dexamethasone, you have to give 4 doses of dexamethasone, 6 grams, 12 hours apart. Whereas when we talk about betamethasone, you have to give 2 doses of betamethasone 24 hours apart. 2 doses, 12 grams each, 24 hours apart. Now, please remember that earlier it was said that corticosteroids, they should be given in all cases of preterm labor when preterm labor is happening at less than 34 weeks. And if preterm labor was happening between 34 weeks to 36 weeks plus 6 days, then you may or you may not give corticosteroids. Now it is said that corticosteroids are recommended between 34 weeks to 36 weeks plus 6 days also. The only difference is if preterm labor is happening at less than 34 weeks, then along with corticosteroids, you are going to give tocolytics. Whereas if preterm labor is happening between 34 weeks to 36 weeks plus 6 days, you are not going to give tocolytics. Right? Now, even when you are giving tocolytics at less than 34 weeks, the time duration for which you have to give tocolytics is only 48 hours. So you have to give it for a very short time so that, corticosteroids action can come. So time taken for corticosteroids to act after the last injection is 48 hours. Along with it, you have to remember that if preterm labor is happening at less than 34 weeks, specifically if it is happening at less than 32 weeks, then not only we have to give dexamethasone for lung maturity, we also have to give magnesium sulfate for neuroprotection. So when preterm labor happens at less than 34 weeks, I am going to give magnesium sulfate for neuroprotection, corticosteroids plus tocolytics. And please remember that you are going to take a rectovaginal swab for group B streptococci, right? So in all cases, you will have to take a rectovaginal swab for group B streptococci infection, right? Now, whenever preterm labor is happening between 34 weeks to 36 weeks plus 6 days, you are going to give corticosteroids and, nothing else. You don't have to give magnesium sulfate. You don't have to give any tocolytics. Clear? Okay. Now, which corticosteroid is recommended by Government of India? Government of India recommends dexamethasone. Next question, which of the following is a recommendation of WHO in the management of second stage of labor? Now, even if you were not very sure about all the other options, you were very sure that so many times in the class, so many times in the test and discussions, everywhere we have discussed that episiotomy should not be given in all cases. WHO does not recommend episiotomy for all cases, and episiotomy should be given only when it is indicated. Right? Now, recently, WHO has released a few guidelines for management of labor, and I'm just now going to share those guidelines with you. But please remember that WHO says that for preventing perineal tear, warm compresses to the perineum, yes, they should be given. Right? Warm compress to the perineum is something which WHO is now recommending that it can prevent perineal tear, and it is recommended by WHO because when you give a warm compress, the muscles relax, and because of that, the chances of perineal tear are less. Not only this, WHO also says that massaging the perineum is going to help. So now WHO, what are the things which WHO recommends? So number one, what WHO recommends, I want all of you to write. To prevent perineal tear, it recommends warm compresses to the perineum. Number two, massaging of the perineum. And number three, it says guarding of the perineum. So with your one hand, you are going to guard the perineum when the head is being delivered. You are not going to be in a rush to deliver the head. It has to be a controlled delivery of the head, and you are going to put your one hand on the perineum to guard the perineum while you are delivering the head. Now, please remember that when you deliver the head, initially you have to maintain the head inflection. So when you are in your labor room, you would have seen the obstetricians, your consultants, doing like this. Why they are doing it? Because they want the smallest diameter to come out of the inlet. When the head of the baby is flexed, in those cases, the diameter which comes out is the suboccipitobrachmatic diameter, which is 9.5 centimeters and the smallest. So what we do is initially we try to flex the head so that it is the smallest diameter which comes out first, and the chances of perineal tear are less, and then we are going to extend the head, right? So in this option number A, in option A, the first half of the statement that manual perineal support, yes, WHO recommends manual perineal support, but then maintaining the head in deflection at the time of delivery, no. When the head of the baby becomes deflexed, then the diameters which come into play are suboccipitofrontal and occipitofrontal, and both of them are more than 9.5 centimeters, right? That is why we do not maintain the head in deflection. We maintain the head in flexion and then we extend the head for final delivery. Right? So again, option A is incorrect. Option C was incorrect. Then coming to option D. Delivery should be conducted in lithotomy position. No. Delivery, WHO says that delivery can be conducted in any position of a female's choice. Right? So over here, the answer to the question is warm compresses to the perineum. Right? So, there is a very recent update, recent guidelines on WHO, the steps which are recommended by WHO during labor and the steps which are not recommended by WHO. This is something which I want all of you to note. And yes, there are a few confusing statements which are given by WHO. So, I'm going to just tell you how you are going to answer those questions also if questions come on those confusing areas. So, number one, the WHO recommends that for a parturient female, a female who is in labor, a companion of choice can be present. That is recommended by WHO. Now, a very important change which WHO has now given is that latent phase now, according to WHO's modified guidelines, are from true labor pains and up till 4 centimeters. From 5 centimeters to 10 centimeters is active phase. Now, till now, we have been teaching you in class that whenever a question comes on partogram, you have to say that latent phase is up till 3 centimeters and active phase begins at more than equal to 4 centimeters. According to American College of Gynecologists, and for all your clinical questions, latent phase is up till 5 centimeters and active phase is more than equal to 6 centimeters. Now, WHO's modified guidelines say that latent phase is up till 4 centimeters and active phase is more than equal to 5 centimeters. Now, you are not going to get confused. Suppose your question is on partogram. In a partogram, WHO has not changed partogram. So for all your, information related to partogram, for all plottings on partogram, you are going to follow what we have told you in class. And what we have told you in class is that for a partogram, latent phase is up till 3 centimeters and active phase is more than equal to 4 centimeters. Right? But if the question specifically asks you which is more likely in your upcoming INI set exam in the central institutes rather than in your NEET, they may ask you about the modified WHO guidelines. Now, according to modified WHO guidelines, active phase is beginning at 5 centimeters. Right? Do not get confused. So, if your question comes that on a partogram, plotting should begin at, so now your answer is going to remain the same because for partogram, the guideline hasn't changed. So for a partogram, the plotting should begin in active phase and it should begin at 4 centimeters. You are not going to say there that it begins at 5 centimeters, right? That is a very, very important change which WHO has made. Number 2, WHO said till now they didn't give any definition or any timeline for active phase. Right now they say that in a primigravida female, active phase can extend up till 12 hours and in a multigravida female, it can extend up till 10 hours. Now understand, till now we were reading and we were studying that WHO says that in active phase, minimum rate of cervical dilatation should be 1 centimeter per hour. So from 4 centimeters, which was the earlier guideline and which partogram follows, from 4 centimeter to 10 centimeter, maximum a female should take 6 hours. And if she's taking more than 6 hours, then we say that this is abnormal progress of the labor. Because alert line on a partogram is made on this very principle that in active phase, dilatation should be at least 1 centimeter per hour. Right? Now WHO is saying that cervical dilatation of at least 1 centimeter per hour in active phase, this was earlier. Now it says intervention to be done. So that is not recommended. So this is now not recommended by WHO. WHO says that now they say that in active phase, dilatation can be less than 1 centimeters per hour also. Right? And so now they say that intervention to be done if cervical dilatation is less than 1 centimeter per hour. Again, that is not recommended by them. So now they are saying it is not necessary that in active phase that the dilatation should be 1 centimeter per hour and you have to do an intervention if dilatation becomes less than 1 centimeter per hour as depicted by alert line. So again, this is a controversy which has been created by WHO. In partogram, the moment the progress of the labor slows down, right? And the moment the progress of the patient goes to the right of alert line, we say that now the obstetrician should become alerted and now is the time when she will have to take action the moment the progress is going to touch action line, right? Now WHO is saying that even if the dilatation is going less than 1 centimeter per hour, it is not necessary for you to take action. So again, I am telling you, bachcho, don't get confused. Whatever concepts we have built for you for partogram, patogram that remain the same. These are just in one corner of your brain. You have to just, put it there that yes, this is something which now WHO is saying. But for all your clinical questions, for all your questions related to patogram, you are not going to apply this unless and until WHO changes the patogram. Right? This is just one piece of information which you are going to digest, and you are just going to keep it on, at one side that, okay, I know this, what are the WHO's new recommendations, but I'm going to follow the old recommendations because patogram still hasn't changed. Right? Okay. Then, at the time of admission, WHO recommends that auscultation of the fetal heart rate should be done by a stethoscope or Doppler. WHO does not recommend a few things at the time of admission. And what are the things which it does not recommend at the time of admission? It does not recommend a routine CTG. It does not recommend routine clinical pelvimetry in every pregnant female. It does not recommend perineal or pubic shaving, and it does not recommend enema. So these are the things which are not recommended by WHO. During labor, WHO recommends that yes, intermittent auscultation of the fetal heart sounds should be done with the help of stethoscope and with the help of Doppler, but continuous CTG monitoring is not done. Please understand, see, the guidelines which WHO gives is always for low resource settings. Right? So obviously, if you are in a private hospital where you have availability of a CTG, you may do it. This is for limited resources that it says that continuous CTG monitoring should not be done in every female. It should be reserved only for high-risk females. Right? Then the next recommendation is digital per vaginal examination should be done every 4 hours in active phase, and that remains the same. Till now, we were also teaching you every 4 hours. Then for pain relief, WHO says that out of this basket which it is providing, a pregnant female can choose which kind of pain relief system she wants. They say you can give either epidural analgesia or opioids, or she can practice any relaxation technique or manual techniques like warm compresses. Another very important thing is, to every pregnant female who is in labor, you are not going to put IV fluids. If the female is low risk, you are going to allow her to take oral fluid and food, and mobility is also allowed in low risk females. Now, just because you want to prevent a delay in labor, you are not going to do ARM, you are not going to give oxytocin, antispasmodics or IV fluid. You are going to do ARM and oxytocin only when indicated, not because you want to prevent a delay in labor. Similarly, WHO says that at the time of labor, cleaning of perineum with chlorhexidine, that is betadine, for preventing infection is not recommended. Now comes what are the recommendations of WHO for second stage of labor, and that is where the question was asked. So exactly from these guidelines, the question was asked that WHO recommends any position of a pregnant female of choice, including upright position, number 1. WHO recommends warm compresses, perineal massage, and guarding or hands on the perineum during the delivery of fetal head. So these are the recommendations which are given by WHO for the second stage of labor. From here the question was asked in your INI set. Please remember that fundal pressure and routine episiotomy are not recommended by WHO in the second stage. As far as the third stage of labor is concerned, WHO hasn't made any change in active management of third stage of labor. Whatever steps were being followed by the WHO for the active management of third stage of labor, they continue to be the same, right? And as you all know that we've already told you that in the active management of third stage of labor, the fourth step, which was intermittent assessment of the uterine tone, it has now replaced the uterine massage. So uterine massage is not recommended by WHO in the third stage of labor, right? Now, these are also the recommendations of WHO for the care of the baby. I don't know whether you know these updates or not, whether your pediatrics faculty has told you these updates or not. So please, if you are getting time, just pause this video, note these updates for the care of the newborn so that you have everything at one place. Now, coming to the next question, a question which is from a topic which is asked so many times, and that is Bishop score. You have to calculate the Bishop score in this patient. So many times in my lectures also, I keep on telling you that there are 3 scores in entire OBGY which are very important, which you have to revise before you go for any exam. So last day before your exam, you have to revise Bishop score, you have to revise biophysical score, the biophysical score, which is the Manning score, and you have to revise WHO's risk score for choriocarcinoma. Right? These are the 3 scores which you have to revise apart from APGAR score, which you're going to do in pediatrics. Right? Now, in this case, the question is saying that station is -1. Okay, so just let me show you Bishop score. Now, in Bishop score, there are 5 criterias, and these criterias are, you know the mnemonic, that is Delhi Police Employed Special Commandos, where D stands for dilatation of the cervix, police P stands for position of the cervix, E stands for effacement of the cervix, employed special commandos, S stands for station of fetal head, and C stands for consistency of the cervix. Right? Now, out of all these 5 criteria, there are these 2 criteria, the position and the consistency, in which the score goes maximum up till 2. Whereas in rest 3, the score goes maximum up till 3. Now, that means maximum Bishop score can be 13. Right? Out of this 13, if score is less than equal to 5, then we say it is a poor score. Right? If score is more than equal to 6, then we say that yes, it is a good score. And if score is more than equal to 9, then the chances of success of induction of labor are very high. Right? Now, in your question, it was said that you have to calculate the Bishop score, and it was saying that the cervix is posterior. Now, because cervix is posterior, the score will be 0. Then your question said that it is a soft cervix. Now, because it is a soft cervix, I'm going to give a score of 2. Then your question said it is 30% effaced and 1 centimeter dilated. Right? So, and it said that the station of fetal head is at -1 station, as far as I remember. Yes, it is -1 station. Now, because it is -1 station, you are going to again give a score of 2. So, that makes a total score of 5. And if the score is 5 or less, then that means that's a poor score. Right? Please remember that you don't have to forget this table. This table should be in front of your eyes, on wherever you are studying. Just make on a chart Bishop score, biophysical score, and WHO score, and just put it there. Right? Okay. Now, what is a modified Bishop score? Modified Bishop score has only one change. In modified Bishop score, instead of effacement, we have the length of cervix. So, instead of effacement, there is length of cervix, and length of cervix is measured on ultrasound. Right? Then we have something which is called as a simplified Bishop score. Simplified Bishop score is diethyl stilbestrol. That is how I tell you to remember it. D stands for, there are only 3 criteria which are used in simplified Bishop score, diethyl stilbestrol. D stands for dilatation of the cervix. E stands for effacement of the cervix. And S stands for station of fetal head. Right? So, modified Bishop score, simplified Bishop score, and Bishop score, everything about Bishop score you should be knowing. Then, next question, which of the following modalities are used for diagnosis of placenta accreta? Now, placenta, whether they are saying placenta accreta, whether they are saying placenta increta or parcreta, all of them, they come under the placenta accreta spectrum. And what is the problem, or what is the pathology in these kinds of placenta? The problem is that there is absent Nitabuch's layer. It is the Nitabuch layer which limits the penetration of the blastocyst, right? And now if this layer is not there, now the blastocyst is going to penetrate deeper, and the chorionic villi, instead of getting attached to the endometrium, they would be attached to the myometrium, or in very severe cases like in placenta percreta, it would be attached to the serosa. The second problem over here is there is absent decidua basalis. Right? So in placenta accreta, the chorionic villi, they are attached partially to the myometrium. In placenta increta, they are attached completely to the myometrium. And in placenta percreta, it is attached, the chorionic villi are attached to the serosa. Now, investigation of choice in case of placenta accreta spectrum is ultrasound, and simultaneously I'm going to do a Doppler. Common sense tells me that if I am finding abnormal blood vessels which are running from the Doppler into the myometrium, that would indicate that yes, it is a case of placenta accreta, increta or percreta. On ultrasound, you get characteristic findings like you get intraplacental lakes, and there is a loss of subplacental sonolucent area. This subplacental sonolucent area is the decidua basalis. So on ultrasound, now you will not be able to see decidua basalis. And if you are in doubt, then if after ultrasound and Doppler you are still in doubt, then you go for MRI. But investigation of choice is ultrasound and Doppler in case of placenta accreta. When should you be suspecting placenta accreta? What are the risk factors? A very important risk factor is if there is previous history of cesarean section and in present pregnancy patient has got placenta previa. Now, if I have recognized placenta previa in antenatal period, then my management will be that I am going to do a cesarean hysterectomy. But if I did not recognize placenta previa in antenatal period, then patient is going to present to me with intractable PPH. And in that case, the management again would be hysterectomy, right? So that is what you need to know about placenta accreta spectrum. Coming to double bleb sign in ultrasound indicates. Now again in classes, I show you these three ultrasound together. And all these three ultrasounds are step by step what you are going to see in a intrauterine pregnancy. Now in intrauterine pregnancy, first thing which is going to happen is that the blastocyst is going to implant, right, in the endometrium, and this is what is called as the intradecidual sign, where you are going to get a gestational sac inside the endometrium, and that is intradecidual sign, which is the first sign of pregnancy on ultrasound. The first structure which is seen on ultrasound is a G-sac, but the first sign which is seen on ultrasound in pregnancy is a intradecidual sign. Right? Now what is going to happen is, suppose if this over here is the uterine cavity. Now once implantation has happened, all of you know that instead of endometrium, we are going to call it as the decidua. Now this blastocyst is going to grow. So this blastocyst will grow, right? Above the blastocyst, separating it from the uterine cavity. That is what is called as decidua capsularis. Now the endometrium which is present below the blastocyst, that is the site for future placenta formation, that is decidua basalis, and the rest of the endometrium everywhere, anywhere else is decidua parietalis. Right? Now, in this case, where if I am going to do an ultrasound, I am going to see a uterine cavity like this. The blastocyst would have impinged on the uterine cavity, and I am going to see two layers of endometrium being separated, surrounding that blastocyst, right? This first layer of endometrium, which is separating the blastocyst from the uterine cavity, that is what is called as decidua capsularis, and the rest of the endometrium is called as decidua parietalis. So I am going to get a ring-like appearance. The inner ring is decidua capsularis, and the outer ring, this entire outer ring, is decidua parietalis, right? And this is what is called as double decidual ring sign. So double decidual ring sign denotes formation of decidua capsularis and parietalis. And it also tells us that till now decidua capsularis and parietalis haven't fused. See what happens as this zygote is going to grow, right? Now what is going to happen when it is going to grow? This capsularis is going to come near and near the parietalis. Ultimately, there will be a time when decidua parietalis and decidua capsularis will fuse, and that is going to happen between 14 to 16 weeks, and the uterine cavity would be obliterated. Now, you will not see both the deciduas in the form of a separate ring. It is only in early pregnancy that you are seeing both the deciduas in the form of a separate ring. Then what happens is, simultaneously in the blastocyst, what is happening? Simultaneously in the blastocyst, there are the outer layer of cells which are called as the trophoblast, and there is the inner cell mass, and inner cell mass is called as the embryoblast. So this inner cell mass is gradually going to form. Initially, it is going to form two germ layers, right? So it is going to form the epiblast and the hypoblast. Epiblast and hypoblast. Now, with the formation of these two germ layers, you can see that now the gestational sac is divided into two cavities. You have one cavity which is facing towards the epiblast, which is lined by the epiblast, which is called as the amniotic cavity. And you have another one which is lined by the hypoblast, right? That is what is called as the yolk sac. And this is what is called as a double bleb sign. In double bleb sign, you are going to see two bubbles, right? So as you can see over here, one bubble and a second bubble. Right? So these two bubbles are, one is the amniotic sac and the other one is your yolk sac. Now, how am I going to recognize which one is amniotic sac and which one is yolk sac? In the amniotic sac, you will get the fetal pole. So fetal pole is present in amniotic sac. So if you look very closely, in amniotic sac, you will be able to see some solid structure if you look very closely over here. Yes, so you will eventually be able to tell which one is the amniotic sac and which one is the yolk sac. So have you understood how these signs are seen? Initially, you're going to get an intradecidual sign, then you are going to get a double decidual ring sign, and then you are going to get a double bleb sign. And double bleb sign indicates that yes, the yolk sac has formed, and that means it's a marker of intrauterine pregnancy. Because in gestational sac can be seen in ectopic pregnancy also, because the gestational sac can be true gestational sac or it can be a pseudo gestational sac. But yolk sac will be present only in a true gestational sac. Yolk sac will never be present in for a pseudo gestational sac. That is why the moment you start getting a double bleb sign, you are sure that this is a case of intrauterine pregnancy. Clear to all of you? Now, so the question over here was double bleb sign in ultrasound indicates. So double bleb sign in ultrasound indicates yolk sac and amniotic sac. Now there are certain other important points related to ultrasound and early pregnancy which I want you to be very, very clear about. See, gestational sac, first of all the things, all the structures, they are going to appear earlier on TVS and they are going to appear 1 week later on transabdominal scan. Right? Now, as far as gestational sac is concerned, the time for visualizing gestational sac is 4 weeks plus 3 days of the LMP, and if 4 weeks plus 3 days is not given, then your answer will be 5 weeks. Right? So the earliest gestational sac can be visible on TVS is 5 weeks. Yolk sac is visible by 4 weeks, 5 days. Poles can be seen, the fetal poles can be seen by 5 weeks, and cardiac activity can be seen between 5 to 6 weeks. And if they ask you one single answer, then you're going to say that it can be seen by 6 weeks. So this is something which you have to remember, right? Okay. Coming to the next question. A 10-week primigravida presents with bleeding PV. On examination, uterus corresponds to 12-week sign. So there is bleeding PV and the size of the uterus is 12 weeks. So over here, it was 10 weeks. She's 10 weeks pregnant, but the size of the uterus is more than the period of gestation. TVS was done and it is given below. What is your diagnosis? So over here, this is a very clear-cut diagnosis of a molar pregnancy. But please remember that even if your question would have not said that a TVS was done, right? If the question would have said that in this case a patient had hyperemesis gravidarum, and beta HCG levels were increased. And they would have asked you, what is the next step in management? Please remember that I am not going to jump to management immediately unless and until I do a TVS to confirm my findings. Right? So always in molar pregnancy, there can be two types of questions. One question where they give you a TVS and they ask you either to diagnose it, or they can ask you for the next step once they have given you the TVS. Now, again, just one more point which you have to remember, that in a patient of molar pregnancy, there are two investigations which you have to do before you say that I am going to jump to management. One is ultrasound and the other is beta HCG levels. Without beta HCG, baseline beta HCG levels, and without getting an ultrasound done, I am not going to go to the management. Only if I have done these two things, then I am going to go to the management. This time the question was very simple on diagnosis. But next time they can ask you a question where they give you that the size of the uterus is bigger than the POG. They give you that a patient is having hyperemesis gravidarum. They give you that fetal heart tones are not heard, and they ask you what is the next step, and in the option suction evacuation would be written. So please remember, you are not going to jump to suction evacuation. First you are going to say I'm going to get an ultrasound done. And suppose your question says that ultrasound was done, then your next step will be that I'm going to get a beta HCG level done, the baseline beta HCG level, and then I'm going to go to suction evacuation. Is that clear to all of you? Okay. Now, in case of complete mole, you get this typical picture which is called as the snowstorm appearance, right? And this appearance you get in case of a complete mole. The other name for complete mole is a high datiform mole or a vesicular mole, right? And the karyotype which you get in a vesicular mole is 46XX, whereas partial moles are triploid. And in case of partial mole, when you will do an ultrasound, you are going to get a picture very similar to incomplete abortion, right? And in ectopic pregnancy, what do you get? What is the diagnostic marker for ectopic pregnancy on ultrasound? Tell me, what is the diagnostic marker? So do not do this mistake. Never say that the diagnostic marker for ectopic pregnancy on ultrasound is the ring of fire appearance. Never do this mistake. The diagnostic marker of ectopic pregnancy on ultrasound is if you get cardiac activity, if you get a G-sac, if you get fetal poles, any of these in the tubes. If you are getting any of these in the tubes, that is a diagnostic marker. For ring of fire appearance is not a diagnostic marker for ectopic pregnancy on ultrasound. Clear? Okay. Coming to the next, tell me, what are you going to do as management? You are going to do the management of complete mole for our suction evacuation. But if your question says that it is a case of complete mole, plus female is more than 40 years, plus her family is complete. If all these three criteria are present, then you are going to say that I am going to do a hysterectomy. Right? A total abdominal hysterectomy. And whether you do hysterectomy, whether you do suction evacuation, you have to follow up the patient for 6 months, and you have to advise her to take oral combined pills for 6 months, so that, and that is the time period for follow-up, and during these 6 months, she shouldn't get pregnant. Right? Okay. Next. And again, a very, very important question, dosages of drugs which are used in PPH and in active management of third stage of labor is very, very important. Molar pregnancy, ectopic pregnancy, and types of abortions. Again, that's very, very important for all your central institutes. Dose of carbitocin in the management of PPH. Now, what is carbitocin? Carbitocin is a synthetic oxytocin. The advantage of carbitocin over natural oxytocin is that the T half of oxytocin is 3 to 4 minutes. Right? So oxytocin has a very, very short half-life, but carbitocin has a longer half-life and its T half is 30 to 40 minutes. Another difference between oxytocin and carbitocin is oxytocin is a nonapeptide, whereas carbitocin is an octapeptide. Now, the dose of carbitocin which you have to use is 100 micrograms, which has to be given slow IV over 1 minute. Now, what we tend to do is when we do drugs of active management of third stage of labor and PPH, we think that all these drugs can be used interchangeably. The drugs which are being used in active management of labor can also be used for PPH. Now, that is a mistake, common mistake which many students do. Please remember that there are two drugs which are not going to be used interchangeably. Number one is carbitocin. Carbitocin has been recommended only for active management of third stage of labor, number one. And number two drug is carboprost. Carboprost is recommended only for management of PPH and not for prevention of PPH in the form of active management of third stage of labor. Right? So, oxytocin, yes, oxytocin is recommended both in AMTSL and in PPH management, and its dose is 10 units for active management, 20 international units for PPH. When we give oxytocin, we have to give it either as IV infusion or you can give it as intramuscularly. You never give oxytocin IV bolus because it can lead to hypotension and it can lead to cardiac arrest. Another very important thing is that when you are making an infusion of oxytocin, always make it in ringer lactate or normal saline. Never make it in dextrose 5% solution, because if you make a solution of oxytocin in D5 in electrolyte deficient media, then it can lead to water intoxication because it also has antidiuretic effect like ADH. Both of them are being released by posterior pituitary, so oxytocin also has some antidiuretic properties, and that is why it should not be given along with electrolyte deficient media. That's again very important thing. Then comes methyl ergometrin. Yes, methyl ergometrin can also be given for active management and for PPH, and its dose is 0.2 mg intramuscularly. A very important side effect of methyl ergometrin is that it leads to increase in BP transiently. So there is a severe transient hypertension, and that is why there are 5 contraindications for methyl ergometrin which you have to remember. Number 1, methyl ergometrin is contraindicated in preeclampsia patients, in eclampsia patients. It is contraindicated in patients with heart disease. Now, if a patient with heart disease, if you give them methyl ergometrin, the uterus is going to contract suddenly and entire blood is going to go into the patient's circulation. It's going to return from the uterus into her circulation, and that can precipitate heart failure. Another very important difference between methyl ergometrin and oxytocin is oxytocin leads to physiological contractions. What are physiological contractions? See, normally also in labor, when labor pains are happening, contractions are coming, they have a tendency of coming and going, coming and going. Contractions are never, permanently present. And the reason which is the advantage of contraction coming and going is at the time of contraction to the fetus, very less blood goes. Right? So blood goes to the fetus only when uterus is relaxed. So if uterus is technically contracted, the amount of blood coming to the fetus would be less and there will be fetal distress. This is exactly the difference between oxytocin and methyl ergometrin. Oxytocin, when it leads to contractions, they are physiological. Uterus would contract and slightly relax, contract and relax. But methyl ergometrin is going to lead to tetanic contractions, and because it leads to tetanic contractions, it is never given during pregnancy, and that is why you can never give it after delivery of first twin. You may give it after delivery of second twin, and that is why it is absolutely absolutely contraindicated in Rh negative pregnancies. Coming to mesoprost, for active management of third stage of labor, till now the dose which was recommended by WHO was 600 micrograms orally. Now WHO has given a recent modification saying that it can be given between 400 to 600 micrograms orally for active management of third stage of labor. For prevention of PPH, the dose is 800 micrograms, which you have to give sublingually. Now, WHO doesn't recommend per rectal use of mesoprost, but yes, during PPH, you can give mesoprost per rectally, and then the dose is between 800 to 1000 micrograms. One route by which we do not give mesoprost tablet during a patient during the time of PPH is per vaginal route. Obviously, if the patient is bleeding, you cannot give mesoprost per vaginally. Then comes carboprost. Carboprost is used only for treatment of PPH, and the dose of carboprost is 250 micrograms. Maximum you can give up till 8 doses, that is maximum you can give 2 milligrams. The route of giving carboprost is IM, and its contraindications, asthma, all of you remember, but what you forget is it is contraindicated in hypertensive patients and in amniotic fluid embolism patients also. Remember that one contraindication of mesoprost is if there is previous history of cesarean section. Now, just one more drug which you have to remember is Tranexa. Injection tranexamic acid is an additional drug. This drug you can give with oxytocin for treatment of PPH, and the dose, it can be used in prevention also, but mostly it is being used for treatment of PPH. You have to give 1 gram slow IV, and it should be given as early as possible within 3 hours of initiation of oxytocin. Right? So these are the drugs which are used for management of PPH. Milk production in pregnancy is inhibited by a very, very simple question. See, all of us know that the highest levels of prolactin, they are seen during pregnancy. Right? But during pregnancy, milk production doesn't happen. Why does this doesn't happen? This doesn't happen because of raised estrogen and progesterone during pregnancy. This raised estrogen and progesterone during pregnancy, they inhibit prolactin. So the first stimulus for initiation of lactation after delivery, the first stimulus is decrease in estrogen and progesterone. The moment estrogen and progesterone decrease, the inhibition on prolactin is gone, prolactin levels increase, and that is the first stimulus for initiation of lactation after delivery. Now, between estrogen and progesterone also, if you have to choose one answer, then it is going to be decreased progesterone. Right? So over here, milk production in pregnancy is inhibited by high estrogen levels. Okay, the next question was a visual question where a 19-year-old girl presented to you with irregular cycles, weight gain. Neck of the patient showed given findings the findings which are given in the image, which you can see is darkening of skin, that is acanthosis nigricans. On ultrasound, ovaries were found to have increased volume. Which of the following is used in the treatment? Okay, now please understand that in this question, yes, we have made a provisional diagnosis of PCOS. Now, over here, they are not telling you with which complaint the patient is coming to you, right? Now, whenever you get a question on PCOS and it's a blanket question where they are not telling you what complaint the patient comes to you with, remember, for all complaints, the first thing what you have to do is you have to advise lifestyle modifications so that the weight of the patient decreases, right? Now, if your question is, what is the drug of choice of PCOS? Nothing else. They're not asking about irregular cycles, about hirsutism. Then overall, the drug of choice for a PCOS patient are oral combined pills. Now, in a 19-year-old girl, definitely infertility is not something with what is the concern, right? And in this question, one option is related to infertility, that is laparoscopic ovarian drilling. Now, even if you didn't know any other thing, there were a combination of three treatments were being combined in the options. So, if a combination of 3 has to be answered, and I know that laparoscopic ovarian drilling is a method for treating infertility, and in a 19-year-old girl, that never be a complaint. So, automatically, I have come to the answer, and the answer is that it has to be 2, 3, and 4. Right? Now, as far as hirsutism is concerned, For hirsutism, again, the first step which you are going to recommend will be weight diet modification, so that there is weight reduction, lifestyle modification, diet modification. Then what is the drug of choice? Drug of choice for hirsutism is you are going to give oral combined pills, and you have to use oral combined pills for a period of 6 months. And after that, if hirsutism is not getting resolved, then you are going to add spironolactone. Right? So I will not say that we are going to start OCPs and spironolactone together, but since over here in the options they were combination of 3 things. So that is why I'm going to go for 2, 3 and 4. If suppose there would have been, I have to choose any 2, I would have chosen lifestyle modification and oral combined pills. If I had to choose any one, then yes, the first step which I would have told her would have been lifestyle modification. The drug which I would have prescribed to her would have been an oral combined pill, because for irregular cycles, for hirsutism, for the drug of choice is oral combined pills, right? Then what are the third line drugs which you can use for managing hirsutism? So this over here becomes your first line drug, oral combined pills. Spironolactone becomes your second line drug. Third line drug for managing hirsutism in a PCOS patient is continuous GnRH. You can give finasteride. You can give eflornithine cream. Right, so these are the third line drugs which are being used for managing hirsutism in PCOS. Please remember that 2 drugs which you read in gynae, danazol and tibolone, both of their side effects are hirsutism. So both these drugs can never be used for managing hirsutism in any patient, right? Because the side effect is hirsutism. Okay. Now, as far as insulin resistance is concerned, for insulin resistance, so whenever your question of PCOS says that there is insulin resistance, along with whatever problem she has, I'm going to add metformin, right? So whether it is Hair-N syndrome, Hair-N syndrome is hyperandrogenism, then insulin resistance and acanthosis nigricans. So in insulin resistance and in Hair-N syndrome, I am going to add metformin to whatever treatment I am giving to that patient. Right? Now over here for your central institutes, I want you to know 3 scores. One is the score for hirsutism. The scoring system for hirsutism is the Ferryman-Galway score. Then you have a scoring for virilization. And the scoring for virilization is called as a Prader score. And the third score is a very recently introduced score, which is a score for appearance of external genitalia in XY children. Right? And that is called as a Quigley score. Right? So these are the scores which you have to remember. Coming to next question, which is again related to PCOS, not true about clomiphene citrate. Now, what is clomiphene citrate? It is a selective estrogen receptor modulator drug. And what does it do? It decreases the levels of estrogen. So the negative feedback on FSH is gone. So the levels of FSH increase when you give clomiphene citrate. Because it decreases estrogen, it causes endometrial thinning. Because it increases FSH, that is why there is increased risk of twin pregnancy. Right? Please remember that increased risk of multifetal pregnancy, it is highest with HMG. Twin pregnancy, yes, the chances in clomiphene citrate are increased and the chances are 6 to 10%. It has a negative feedback on GnRH. Yes, it can be used with gonadotropins. Yes, it can be used with gonadotropins. It causes monofollicular development. No, it leads to twin pregnancy. But please be very, very careful. If they ask you what is the most common side effect of clomiphene citrate, then you are not going to say twin pregnancy. The most common side effect of clomiphene citrate is hot flushes. right? What is the drug of choice for ovulation induction in PCOS patients? The drug of choice for ovulation induction in PCOS patients is letrozole. What is the drug of choice for ovulation induction in other cases of anovulation? So in other cases of anovulation, it is still clomiphene citrate. And what is the drug of choice for ovulation induction in IVF cycles? For IVF cycles, we do not use letrozole or clomiphene citrate, we use HMG. Right? Now, what are the advantages of letrozole over clomiphene citrate? Number one advantage is there are increased chances of live birth. Number two, it leads to a single pregnancy. Right? Whereas in clomiphene citrate, there are increased chances of twin pregnancy. And number three, there is no chance of ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome. It doesn't lead to ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome. As far as clomiphene citrate and HMG are concerned, both can lead to ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome, but then ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome is maximum with HMG. Clear to all of you? Okay. Next question. All of the following are long-acting reversible contraceptive methods. That's a very, very plain, simple question. Since they're talking about reversible methods, definitely it cannot be laparoscopic tubal ligation. Laparoscopic tubal ligation, for all practical purposes, is a permanent method. Rest, whether it is copper T, whether it is implanon, and please, the fourth option was not combined pills. It was injection Depo-Provera. Right? Depo-Provera. So whether it is copper T, whether it is implanon, whether it is Depo-Provera, all three of them are examples of long-acting reversible contraceptives. So implants, injections and IUCDs, they come under long-acting reversible contraceptives. Tubal ligation, whether you are doing laparoscopically or whether you do by mini laparotomy, it comes under permanent methods. Vasectomy comes under permanent methods. Then whether a female uses pills, whether she uses patches, whether she uses a vaginal ring or a barrier method, all these, they are temporary methods of contraception, right? Next question. A couple presents to infertility clinic with normal HSG and a seminal analysis report with azoospermia. Which of the following test is useful to differentiate between testicular cause and obstructive vas deferens? Now, please remember, in the class also I tell you that if you have to choose between FSH and testosterone, one test which can tell you the difference between obstructive vas deferens and testicular causes, if one test you have to choose, it has to be FSH levels. In case of obstructive causes of vas deferens, FSH levels will be normal. Whereas in case of testicular causes, FSH levels will be high, because the negative feedback will not be there, right? As far as testosterone is concerned, yes, testosterone levels will also be normal in case of obstructive vas deferens, and the testosterone levels will be low in case of testicular cause. But then testosterone is not the first test which you do. The first test which you do, if you want to differentiate between testicular, post-testicular or pre-testicular causes, it has to be FSH. FSH is not only a test to differentiate between these causes, FSH is also the diagnostic test for menopause. So whether they say primary ovarian insufficiency or whether they say premature menopause or menopause, the diagnostic test is FSH. Another place where FSH levels are used is in case of ovarian reserve. So it is a test of ovarian reserve, day 3 FSH, although it's not the best test for ovarian reserve, but yes, FSH is a test. Right? Now, one very important thing which you have to understand, if they ask you what is the most common cause of reversible male infertility, most common cause of reversible male infertility is varicocele. In varicocele, the temperature of the scrotum gets increased, and that is why in varicocele, on semen analysis, the most common finding which you get is a decreased sperm count, and that is one of the previous INI set questions. Decreased sperm count plus increase in abnormal forms. One important thing, if they ask you what is the most common cause of male infertility, they have removed the word reversible from there, then your answer will be testicular causes, that is primary failure. Right? Now, if they ask you what is the problem which you see in Cartagener's syndrome, in Cartagener's syndrome, the problem which you see is asthenospermia. What is the problem which you see in patients of Klinefelter syndrome? In Klinefelter syndrome, you get azoospermia. So the most common semen analysis abnormality in case of Klinefelter syndrome will be azoospermia. What will be the most common finding in cystic fibrosis patients? Again, it will be azoospermia. Now, the difference between Klinefelter and cystic fibrosis azoospermia is, in cystic fibrosis, there is congenital bilateral absence of vas deferens, and so azoospermia will be obstructive azoospermia. Whereas in Klinefelter, it will be a non-obstructive azoospermia. Clear? So these are questions which they can ask you. Just one more question which is very important is in semen analysis, which is the most important criteria. So in semen analysis, the most important criteria is morphology. Please remember, no confusions. Morphology followed by motility followed by concentration. Clear? Okay. Next question. A 62-year-old patient with no history of diabetes and hypertension came with postmenopausal bleeding. Which of the following will you do to evaluate the cause? Okay, now what is postmenopausal bleeding? Any bleeding which is happening after menopause. And how do you define menopause? The clinical definition of menopause is that the patient should have had amenorrhea for 1 year. So after that 1 year, if there is any bleeding which is happening, so many times you people ask me that, ma'am, if bleeding happens after 6 months, it is postmenopausal bleeding, or if bleeding happens after 1 year. See, after 1 year of amenorrhea, if bleeding is happening anytime, it is a postmenopausal bleeding. Now, whenever a patient comes to you with postmenopausal bleeding, the first investigation which we do is a TVS, but a TVS is not the investigation of choice. On TVS, I want to check the endometrial thickness. Why? Because if endometrial thickness is less than 4 millimeters, then I am not suspecting endometrial hyperplasia or endometrial cancer. Then I am suspecting that the reason for this postmenopausal bleeding is senile atrophy. And in this case, you don't have to do endometrial biopsy. The only treatment which you have to give is tranexamic acid and plus follow-up. Right? So on TVS, I have to check the endometrial thickness. If endometrial thickness is more than 4 millimeters, if 4 millimeters is not given in the options, then more than 5 millimeters, but better answer is more than 4 millimeters, right? So then on TVS, if endometrial thickness is more than 4 millimeters, then I am going to go for investigation of choice, which is endometrial biopsy. Now, either in your questions, it can be written as endometrial biopsy or endometrial aspiration cytology. Better is endometrial aspiration cytology. Now, what are the indications for doing endometrial biopsy? Indication is, number one, if you have a postmenopausal bleeding patient with TVS or on TVS endometrial thickness more than 4 millimeters. But please remember, if you have a perimenopausal female with AUB, then no matter what is the ultrasound finding, I am not going to look at the ultrasound finding. I have to do an endometrial biopsy. Very, very important thing. In perimenopausal females, you have to do endometrial biopsy. In postmenopausal females, you have to do it only if endometrial thickness is more than 4 millimeters. Right? Now, the instrument which is used for doing endometrial biopsy in India is a Carmen cannula. Whereas in places where there are better facilities available, the instrument they have special instrument, Pipple or a Vabra aspirator. Right? The gold standard for diagnosing endometrial hyperplasia or endometrial cancer, in other words, gold standard investigation for PMB, if endometrial biopsy comes out to be positive, is fractional curettage plus hysteroscopy. Fractional curettage plus hysteroscopy. What are the indications for doing fractional curettage and hysteroscopy? Very, very important point on which I set, they always have affinity towards this question, you can say. They keep on asking questions on endometrial biopsy and fractional curettage. So the indications for doing fractional curettage are if on endometrial biopsy you get atypical hyperplasia. Number 2, if there is cervical stenosis. Number 3, if your histopathologist says that endometrial tissue was insufficient. So the histopathologist says that repeat the test for me. In that case, I'm going to repeat it with fractional curettage and hysteroscopy. And number 4, if patient has persistent bleeding despite, normal biopsy. So the biopsy report was normal, but patient has persistent bleeding. Again, that's an indication for doing fractional curettage and hysteroscopy. Clear to all of you? Okay. Next question. A 17-year-old was brought by her mother to the outpatient department with complaint of primary amenorrhea. So 17-year with primary amenorrhea. She has normal breast development and pubic hair. On examination, a blind-ending vagina and uterus were not able to palpate. And uterus, okay, so a blind-ending vagina was present and uterus was not able to palpate. Right? What is the most probable diagnosis? Now, in this case, the question is telling you that uterus is absent and a blind-ending vagina is present. Uterus absent is going to rule out Turner's syndrome for us. In Turner's syndrome, the karyotype is 45XO. Gonads are ovaries and these ovaries are streak ovaries, right? In case of Turner syndrome, internal genitalia of female are present, right? So you will have a uterus, although the uterus will not be a full-grown uterus. Why? Because uterus needs estrogen to grow and these ovaries are going to produce less estrogen. So they will have a uterus which will resemble the uterus of an infant, and that is what is called as an infantile uterus. But yes, uterus would be present. Over here, because the question is saying uterus is absent, so Turner syndrome ruled out. Now, gonadal dysgenesis is a problem which includes either Turner syndrome or Swyer syndrome and pure gonadal dysgenesis. All these 3 problems, they come under gonadal dysgenesis. And in all these 3 conditions, whether it is a Turner syndrome, whether it is Swyer syndrome, or whether it is pure gonadal dysgenesis, in all these 3 conditions, uterus will be present. So again, gonadal dysgenesis is ruled out. Now I have to choose between Mullerian agenesis and androgen insensitivity syndrome. In Mullerian agenesis, please remember that the secondary sexual characteristics are well developed because they have properly functioning ovaries. Whereas in androgen insensitivity syndrome, the gonads are testes. They are 46XY. And these males are resistant to testosterone. Because they are resistant to testosterone, the testosterone gets converted into estrogen. So breast development happens. But pubic hair and axillary hair are not well developed because for development of pubic hair and axillary hair in females also androgens are needed, right? So whenever you are confused between androgen insensitivity syndrome and Mullerian agenesis, please remember that androgen insensitivity syndrome is 46XY, Mullerian agenesis is 46XX. Breast development happens in both of them and it is proper breast. Androgen insensitivity syndrome, pubic hair development doesn't happen. It corresponds to Tanner stage 1 or 2. Whereas proper breast pubic hair development corresponding to Tanner stage 4 and 5 is going to happen in Mullerian agenesis. Renal anomalies are seen with Mullerian agenesis. Inguinal hernia, which is actually undescended testes, right, is seen as a complaint in case of androgen insensitivity syndrome. In both of them, you can get a blind vagina. As far as the levels of LH, FSH and testosterone are concerned, in Mullerian agenesis, all these levels will be normal and her testosterone will be a female-like testosterone in the ranges of female, right? So their testosterone is going to be less than 70. That is what happens in females. Now, in case of androgen insensitivity syndrome, the levels of testosterone will be high. High in comparison to females, the normal female levels, they will correspond to normal male levels, but they are resistant to testosterone. these individuals. So the negative feedback on LH and FSH will be gone. So what is going to happen? The levels of LH will increase, the levels of FSH will increase. But also remember that FSH levels are not just controlled by testosterone. FSH levels are also controlled by inhibin B, which is being secreted by Sertoli cells. So now what is going to happen? This inhibin B is going to control the levels of FSH. But levels of LH are going to remain high. So in case of androgen insensitivity syndrome, the levels of LH are high, levels of FSH are normal, and levels of testosterone are high in comparison to a female. Clear to all of you? Yes. Now in androgen insensitivity syndrome, if you are getting absolutely female looking external genitalia, right, then it means it's a case of complete androgen insensitivity syndrome. But if you are getting ambiguous genitalia, in other words, in your questions you are getting words like clitoromegaly, labioscrotal fusion, then it is partial androgen insensitivity syndrome. Clear to all of you? Okay. Coming to the next question, match the following section A with tumor markers in section B. So you have tumors of ovary which are there in section A, and you have to mark them with markers in section B. So quickly let us revise the tumor markers. In tumor markers, you have to remember that for all epithelial cell cancers, CA125 is the tumor marker, but in mucinous tumors, carcinoembryonic antigen CAA is the tumor marker. Right? As far as germ cell tumors are concerned, you have to concentrate on two of them because various combinations can be given for tumor markers. Please remember that the main tumor marker in dysgerminoma is LDH. But then the other tumor markers are HCG and PLAP. Dysgerminomas never produce alpha fetoprotein. On the other hand, in a yolk sac tumor or an endodermal sinus tumor, the main tumor marker is alpha fetoprotein. Then the secondary tumor marker is LDH, and it will never produce HCG. So you just don't have to remember the main tumor marker. You also have to remember the secondary tumor markers and the tumor markers which are not produced by them. Because this time the question was simple. Next time the question could be a combination of tumor markers, and then this table is going to come handy to you. For choriocarcinoma, the tumor marker is HCG. So this one, slide, if you remember, your any question on tumor markers of ovary would be completed. Then a next question, a female presented with frothy vaginal discharge and itching. On examen, she is found to have strawberry cervix. Which of the following is the drug of choice? So this is very, very simple for you that this is a case of trichomonas, and in trichomonas, the drug of choice is metronidazole. So whenever your question is using words like frothy vaginal discharge, right, which is yellowish green in color or it is green in color, right, then pruritus is present, dysuria is present, dyspareunia can be present. On examination, you are getting strawberry cervix, right? Then, and please remember that in case of trichomonas, whiff test may be positive. Normally, it is positive in bacterial vaginosis, but it may be positive in trichomonas also. And when you are going to do a wet mount, you will see motility present. So these are the words which you are going to get whenever they want to talk to you about trichomonas, test to you about trichomonas vaginitis. As far as candidal vaginitis is concerned, in candida you get scanty discharge and it is never foul smelling. It is never foul smelling, and discharge is not the main complaint. Main complaint of the patient is pruritus, intense pruritus. Patient may complain to you of dysuria, and the special word which they are going to give will be splash dysuria. Right? So whenever words like these are used, then it is candida, and in candida the discharge is cottage cheese like discharge. pH in candida is less than 4.5. 5. And whenever they want to talk to you about bacterial vaginosis, in bacterial vaginosis, you get a whitish gray, foul smelling discharge, right? Pruritus will be absent. Dyspareunia will be absent. Dysuria will be absent. Right, pH will be more than 4.5, and they are going to get you words like clue cells, right, Amsel's criteria, Nugent score. All these tell you about bacterial vaginosis, and whiff test is positive. Now, whenever there is physiological discharge under the effect of estrogen, the quantity can be, it can be copious and watery. Under the effect of progesterone, it can be scanty and it can be thick. Now, the things which you are never going to get in physiological discharge, there will be no foul smell, and that is how you're going to differentiate it from bacterial vaginosis. There will be no dysuria, no pruritus, right? No dyspareunia. Clear? Now, whenever you have a patient of vaginal discharge, as per our NACO guidelines, we are going to give them kit 2, which is the green kit, and this green kit is going to have 2 drugs. Number 1, it is going to have fluconazole, 150 mg single tablet, and number 2 tablet secnidazole, right, 2 grams single tablet. So that is kit T2, which is used for syndromic management of vaginal discharge. Partner treatment is not given in syndromic management of vaginal discharge, right? Coming to the next question. A 24-year-old female with complaint of discharge and pruritus, a pap smear show of the discharge is given the diagnosis. Now, see, in this question, on pap smear, you are seeing clue cells. You are seeing that bacteria are adhered to the epithelial cells, right? That is typical of clue cells. So, yes, I am getting clue cells, but on the other hand, there is pruritus. Now, please understand that in bacterial vaginosis, due to secondary infection, pruritus may be seen. Per se, in bacterial vaginosis, there won't be any pruritus. But due to secondary infection, there can be pruritus. And that is why we are going to take it as a case of bacterial vaginosis, and we are going to say it is Gardnerella. Now, appearance of, various organisms on pap smear, that's very important. And nowadays, not only INI set, but NEET has also started giving you to identify organisms on pap smear. So if you get a pap smear image like this, where you are getting clue cells, you can see these are clue cells. Then this is bacterial vaginosis. Now over here in this pap smear, what you are seeing is pear-shaped organisms. And the other important point is that the size of these organisms is roughly equal to the nucleus of the cells. So if you see the size of organisms equal to the nucleus of cells, then it is Trichomonas vaginalis. Trichomonas vaginalis. And on a wet mount, motility will be present. Now look at these hyphae which are seen over here, thread-like structures. So I am seeing hyphae. Plus, if you look at these spores over here, these spores are very small. These spores are smaller than the nuclei. Then you say that it is candidiasis. Clear? Then in this image, what I am seeing, in this image, I am getting a Seekh kebab-like appearance. And this Seekh kebab-like appearance happens when on these pseudohyphae, the epithelial cells, they come and stick together. There is clumping of the epithelial cells. And again, this is seen in Candida. Right? Now, over here in this image, I am seeing that whatever organism is this is bigger than the size of the epithelial cells. We are not talking about the nucleus now. Now, I am seeing that it is bigger than the size of epithelial cells. This is a cotton ball appearance which is seen in actinomyces, which is the most common PID seen in females who are using contraceptives. right? So these are various images which you should be, aware of. Then question number 19, a very, very important question. Which of the following is a formulation of emergency contraceptive used in India? So in India, the emergency contraceptive which is distributed by Government of India and recommended by Government of India is levonorgestrel. Levonorgestrel, you have to give total 1.5 mg. Either you give it as a single dose or 0.5 mg divided into 2 doses separated by 12 hours. So 0.75 mg, 0.75 mg separated by 12 hours. This is what is called as Plan B. Right? Now, whenever you are using levonorgestrel should be given within 72 hours of intercourse. Then comes ulipristal 30 mg single tab. This is the most effective hormonal contraceptive, emergency contraceptive, and this has to be given, it can be given within 5 days of intercourse. Right? Then misoprostol. Misoprostol is never used as an emergency contraceptive, and ethinyl estradiol is, individually or separately, it is never used as an emergency contraceptive. Ethinyl estradiol plus progesterone is used, and the dose or this method is called as USP's method. Also, although it is not used these days, but yes, you should be aware of it. This is also called as Plan A. In USP's method, you are going to give ethinyl estradiol 100 micrograms plus progesterone 0.5 mg, and again you are going to repeat it after 12 hours. Right? Please remember that copper T again can be used as an IUCD within 5 days of intercourse, and although Mirena is not approved by our government, it is not approved by WHO as an emergency contraceptive, but FDA has recently approved Mirena as an emergency contraceptive. Drugs which are never used as emergency contraceptives are misoprost. Don't get confused. Misoprost is never used as an emergency contraceptive. And then danazol. Danazol is also never used as an emergency contraceptive. Clear? Okay. Most commonly seen in a 26-year-old female with intrauterine adhesions. So if there are intrauterine adhesions, that means they are talking about Asherman syndrome. And in Asherman syndrome, the most common problem are menstrual irregularities. And amongst menstrual irregularities, the most common is secondary amenorrhea, followed by hypomenorrhea. Hypomenorrhea means less bleeding. What is the reason for Asherman syndrome? It is if vigorous curettage has been done. So vigorous curettage is the reason for Asherman syndrome. Most common time is if you do this curettage in the postpartum period. What is the most common problem of genital TB? For genital TB, the most common problem is infertility, followed by secondary amenorrhea, followed by oligomenorrhea. That's very important. In genital TB, you get Asherman syndrome, but in Asherman syndrome, the most common problems are menstrual irregularities, followed by infertility. But in genital TB, it is infertility, followed by secondary amenorrhea, and followed by oligomenorrhea. Right? Investigation of choice for Asherman syndrome is hysteroscopy, and management is hysteroscopic adhesiolysis, plus you are going to insert a pediatric Foley's catheter so that adhesions do not form again, followed by estrogen and progesterone to build the endometrium. Now, the hormonal status in Asherman syndrome is, please remember that since the patient is coming to me with secondary amenorrhea, whenever a patient comes to me with secondary amenorrhea, you have to do a urine pregnancy test. Number 1, you have to do LH and you have to do FSH. These are 3 tests which you have to do whenever a patient comes to you with secondary amenorrhea. Now, in patients of, pregnant females, the levels of LH and the levels of FSH will be low because the levels of estrogen and progesterone are high. Whereas in case of Asherman syndrome, the levels of LH and FSH and estrogen, all of them are going to remain normal. Whenever a secondary amenorrhea patient comes to you, you have to do a urine pregnancy test, you have to do LH and you have to do FSH, right? Identify the instrument shown in the image. This is very simple, that the instrument is a Cusco's self-retaining speculum. Now, apart from that, we have two more speculums. This over here is a Sims speculum, which is a non-self-retaining speculum. And we have Ovard speculum. Ovard speculum is used only during surgeries for a very long time. If surgery is being performed, then an ovard speculum is used, and it is used only under anesthesia. And it is also a self-retaining speculum. Now, every one of you should be watching instrument in Obs and Gynae. That's very important. In INI set exams, one instrument is always given. I'm not saying that instrument always is an Obs and Gynae instrument, but then one question on instrument is always there. So on the YouTube, on the Marrow Live channel, you will have an instrument in Obs and Gynae, a video there by me. It is very, very important video. Watch all, see all the instruments which are used in Obs and Gynae, all the instruments which are used during cesarean section, and with the ones which are used for MTP. Clear cell carcinoma of the ovary is a type of. So remember that clear cell carcinoma is a type of epithelial cell tumor. There are three, apart from serous variety, which is the most common type of epithelial cell tumor, we have the mucinous variety. Then there is Brenner's tumor. Then we have clear cell carcinoma, and we have endometrioid variety. So these are all varieties of epithelial cell tumor, and epithelial cell tumor is the most common variety of ovarian tumor, which is seen in 90% females. Now, about endometrioid tumor, you should remember that the histology of endometrioid tumor, it resembles the endometrial glands. It is associated with endometriosis, and it is associated with endometrial cancer. Clear cell carcinoma is a malignant variety. It is associated with endometriosis. It is associated with in utero diethylstilbestrol exposure. Whenever there is in utero diethylstilbestrol exposure, it leads to clear cell carcinomas, right? And the histopathological finding which you get in a clear cell tumor is always hobnail cells. Now, there can be two questions which can confuse you. One is, there are two tumors which are associated with endometriosis, endometrioid variety and clear cell variety. So if someone asks you most common ovarian tumor which is associated with endometriosis, then the best answer is clear cell tumor. If that is not given, then you are going to mark it as endometrioid tumor. But if someone asks you most common tumor associated with endometrial cancer, now one over here we've seen that endometrioid tumor is associated with endometrial cancer, and another one is granulosa cell tumor. Please remember that epithelial cell tumors are always more common than the granulosa cell tumors. So endometrioid tumor is most common ovarian tumor associated with endometrial cancer, followed by granulosa cell tumor. Right? So that is all what I wanted to tell you about the questions which were asked in INI set and other points related to those questions. Now, bacho, another couple of days from now, 2021 is going to end, and all of us are going to greet 2022. I really wish that 2022 treats you really well. All your dreams come true in 2022. May you get selected either in NEET exam or in INI set, and may you get the branch of your choice. So all the best for your exams and a very happy new year.